Hello everyone, Cynthia here, Find Homes Realty. Hope you're doing well. I am going to talk today about seller concessions. What are they? This is when the buyer doesn't have enough cash to pay for their closing costs and requests the seller to pay those fees. This is completely different than what we've discussed before, and that's cooperative brokerage compensation that's being offered by the seller. So let me explain a little bit. So why should sellers account for the possibility of having to do seller concessions? So first, let's recap for a second for the first reason, and that is, as previously discussed, okay, we as sellers should consider building into their list price a buyer broker cooperative compensation, because buyers can't often afford to pay their buyer broker separately, even though they have to sign a buyer brokerage agreement before seeing houses with a licensed agent. Okay, so getting to the seller concessions portion of this, since many buyers are cash poor, let's just face it, but they're monthly payment driven, okay, sellers should anticipate that and build into their list price another percentage to possibly cover some of the buyer's closing costs. And this is called seller concessions. That's something you don't have to say if you don't want to as a seller. You don't have to advertise that. So if the seller gets multiple buyers at their list price, then they can always accept the one that the buyer pays their own closing costs and the buyer pays their own agent separately. Well, that's an additional, what, 5, 6, 7, 8%, whatever is built into their list price that increases the net profit at closing for a seller. So without building that in, though, you could run into issues with appraisals and fewer buyers interested in your property and things like that. So let's switch to a buyer standpoint. So why would a buyer need seller concessions? First of all, a buyer needs to do maybe some work to the property after closing, and they might need to hold on to whatever extra cash they may have saved. And so they need the ability to ask for the seller concessions to keep their cash liquid. Okay, so the buyer's already, as well, trying to save for their down payment, and like for a conventional loan, for example, that needs to be about 20% in order to avoid PMI, or private mortgage insurance, and that might be required by their lender. But there are other conventional loan programs that only require 5%, 10%, 15% as a down payment, but they still need PMI fees added to it. So although the PMI gets lower the higher the deposit, okay? So now on the other hand, if you're a veteran, well, you can get a 100% loan, which is great. But the VA prohibits the buyer broker from paying their own, from being paid by the buyer themselves or the borrower themselves. So without their own representation, and I know I'm slipping back into cooperative brokerage for a minute, but without their own representation, this can lead to a very rocky transaction and maybe even the possibility of it not closing at all. Same thing with an FHA loan. They're required for a 3.5% down, but that can also lead if they do not have buyer representation, because as of right now, the FHA has made it clear that yes, the seller can pay the cooperative brokerage, but the buyer, no. So I think here we can avoid a rocky transaction and maybe even possibly not closing at all if you have a buyer representative, okay, and if the seller pays for that. So now going back into a little bit more of seller concessions, this is something that a buyer should know. For every $10,000 borrowed, okay, say at 7% interest rate, and hope that goes down. But the buyer will pay approximately an extra $67 per month. So the buyer would likely be more able to afford the monthly expenses versus having $10,000 or tens of thousands of dollars in liquid cash to close. Or maybe they just want to, if they have some of that cash, maybe they want that cash to be held on to for closing expenses to improve the property after settlement. So that's a little bit about seller concessions. It's just touching the surface. Happy to answer any questions for you. Just take a look at some of my other blogs, and hopefully we will do some business together in the future. This is it for that. Take care.